to be the CIA director. That pick is being relatively well received by people in both parties and in the national security community. The two other picks, though, are creating more controversy this morning. Trump tapped Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions for the job of U.S. Attorney General and retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn for White House National Security Advisor. The first requires Senate confirmation. The second does not. Both men have records of accomplishment, and both were among Trump's earliest and most devoted supporters. This is in some ways a reward for that loyalty. But they are also both under fire for past statements considered racially and religiously charged, a problem that has plagued now 3 out of the first 5 people Trump has wanted to hire for his administration. So let's start with Sessions, who was denied Senate confirmation for a federal judgeship back in 1986 because of allegations that he had made racially inflammatory statements and disparaged some civil rights organizations such as the NAACP and the ACLU. Today, in a statement, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts displayed outrage. Here's what she said, quote, "Instead of embracing the bigotry that fueled his campaign rallies, I urge President-elect Trump to reverse his apparent decision to nominate Senator Sessions to be Attorney General of the United States. If he refuses, then it will fall to the Senate to exercise fundamental moral leadership for a nation and all of its people." It is rare for a senator to use such charged language about a colleague. James Clyburn, the Democratic congressman from South Carolina, followed after Warren with his own scathing statement regarding Sessions, saying, quote, "His civil rights record is appalling and should disqualify him from Senate confirmation." Cable news has been peppered with reports suggesting there could be a fight over Sessions.
He's expected to be a major player in enforcing and enacting Trump's immigration policy in the fight against sanctuary cities.
He's a fierce combatant, very partisan.
A little troubling given his background.
He's had some controversies in the past.
Some complaints about these racial remarks.
Accused of using the N-word and joking about saying that the KKK was okay.
He was instrumental in passing the Fair Sentencing Act.
I think he believes in the rule of law, and I think will probably get confirmed.
All right, so Donnie, Sessions got support today from his Republican colleagues in the Senate, including Jeff Flake and Lindsey Graham, who some people thought might oppose him. Given the Senate rules, a majority would confirm Sessions. So is this a good pick on the merits, and how controversial is it going to be?
Well, he will get confirmed. And I'm going to go back to the math you did, 3 out of 5. So 3 out of our 5 first picks from Trump have a genuine history of either racism or anti-Semitism. I'm going to always, when I talk about appointees, put my hand back on Steve Bannon. We're not going to let the news go 10 days later. This is a man that has propagated hate and anti-Semitism, misogyny. Now here we have Jeff Sessions, okay? Very simple, a history of it. He did not get appointed as a federal judge because of it.
Confirmed.
Confirmed, I'm sorry. And I don't know when we got to the point where somebody who could not ever be the CEO of a company or the or principal of an elementary school, based on things that they've said and done, we are now kind of going, well,
when we got there is the president-elect would fit that category.
Yeah, that's
too.
a fair thing to say. So I just, politics aside, just as a dad, I'm just disturbed and concerned.
I think that you say he's going to be confirmed, and I suspect he will be, but he's going to be pressed at these hearings to explain the statements he made in the past, the very statements for the most part, although he's made more recent ones, that kept him from being confirmed. And I think, as I've said about Bannon, he's going to have to explain himself. I don't think the answers he gave in his Senate confirmation, which were deemed inadequate, are going to be good enough for this. I think he's going to have to give significantly better answers. On some of these controversial statements, we can run through what they are, but people can go on Google and read about them.
It's not even dignified.
He said, I don't remember saying that, or I didn't say that. He's going to have to show people his heart. He should not be the Attorney General of the United States unless he shows people that in his heart, he's whatever he said in the past, that he will believe in equal protection under the law. He will not treat religious and racially traded statements casually, and he will not make them himself.
Yeah,
and I think it's possible that if he performed poorly in the hearing, he won't be confirmed.
Yeah, it is a fact, and that hate crimes are already up, particularly in schools. You know, they're starting in elementary, and there's usually the word Trump attached to it. I'm not saying Trump is racist, but he has given air cover, and we're going to talk more about Flynn and some of the things that Flynn has said and done is frightening, has given air cover for this. And if we as a society cannot behave with each other properly, we are screwed in the rest of the world. And I'm not a Puritan, and people could make mistakes, but there is an alarming pattern happening here. We've got to be on it, kids.
It's stunning that they sequenced the announcements this way to end up with 3 out of the 5. It's stunning.
All right. And the hits keep getting better. Moving on to Michael Flynn, Donald Trump's new national security advisor. That position does not require Senate confirmation, but like Steve Bannon, Flynn is taking fire today for anti-Muslim rhetoric. The retired lieutenant general tweeted earlier this year this quote, fear of Muslims is rational. His consulting business has reported ties to Middle Eastern countries, and last year he took a paid speaking engagement with Russia's state-run television network and appeared at a gala with President Putin. Mark, same question. Is this a good pick on the merits, and how controversial will it be?
President-elect is entitled, president's entitled to someone who he trusts. If you took these controversial things away, and again, I'm not stipulating that we should, you just look at his record of military service, the fact that he's been iconoclastic and he's challenged authority, the fact that Trump trusts him, I think he would be in some ways a good pick. There's some questions about his temperament as well, but again, if Trump trusts him, and as I said before, Trump's temperament's pretty similar to Flynn's in my experience. These statements must be explained, and even though he's not subject to Senate confirmation, he should not be evasive about them. When he's been asked about these things, he did on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd, he's been evasive. He should explain forthrightly. He should have the confidence of the nation and not hide behind the fact that he doesn't require to be confirmed by the Senate to fail to explain them.
Okay, quotes. Fear of Muslims is rational. That means it makes sense. Call for a complete, total, and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the U.S. On Twitter, he has retweeted from people like Mike Cernovich, Jared Weidland, these crazy, crazy alt-right. His son, Michael Flynn, tweeting, so African Americans can have BET, but whites can't have their own dating site. So we got the racist son also. And on top of that, you mentioned temperament. You know, I'm terrified that a week into Trump's presidency, we get attacked because they want an overreaction. I think the jihadists are salivating at these guys because they want to get the party started, and we need restraint, particularly with guys around Trump. And Trump is doubling down. Tell your wife the Chinese food will be home. I will not let you forget. But that he is doubling down, and I'm terrified. I'm not an expert. I'm just a guy that watches people, and we're in scary terrain here.
He got to explain himself, or he shouldn't have the job.
Yeah.
All right, there was one less controversial pick Donald Trump made today. As we mentioned, the choice of the Kansas Congressman Mike Pompeo to be CIA director. He is not as prominent a figure of the three announced today, but his resume is impressive. It includes West Point and Harvard Law, and he's got a seat on the House Intelligence Committee. He also was on the House committee that investigated the 2012 Benghazi, Libya attacks, where he accused the Obama administration of a cover-up and was one of the harshest critics of the star witness, the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
My question is, why was heaven and earth not moved at the initial sound of the guns, maybe even putting tankers in the air from McConnell Air Force Base in Kansas? You simply didn't know how long the series of events was going to continue, nor did you know how long the risk to the people that work for you was going to remain.
Congressman, you will have to ask the Defense Department these questions.
So Pompeo did get some love from Democrats today, despite his Benghazi hearing performance that some have criticized. The former Bill Clinton Deputy National Security Advisor Nancy Soderberg, California Congressman Adam Schiff, both had reservations about Pompeo's hard-nosed partisan past, but they also called him a respectable choice to head the CIA.
Pompeo could be a perfectly fine national head of our CIA director. He knows the agency, and I think that's a good thing. He's clearly competent.
I think Mike is a very bright guy. He's hardworking. I think he understands the agency very well. So he's a solid pick. Now, Mike can be very partisan, as you saw on the Benghazi hearings, and he'll have to set that aside. But I'm confident that he can do that, and I think he's a very capable choice. So of the three that came out today, I think he was the most solid pick.
Donnie, same question we asked about the first two. Good pick on the merits, and how controversial will he be?
I like it for two reasons. Number one, when I was hiring people, I started with one thing: smart. Okay, Harvard Law School, number one, West Point, obviously very, very smart guy. And I like that he's relatively fresh face. I like there's some new math there. It's not the same names. He's a little bit of a hard-nosed guy, but seems to have a great reputation. Seems to have the right demeanor about him. You look, he was very tough in Benghazi. He still thinks that whole thing was politicized. It was up to him. It'd still be going on. But I think it's a good pick, and I don't think it's going to be controversial.
If being someone aggressive in Benghazi was disqualifying, Donald Trump would have to put only Democrats in his cabinet. I don't know much about him. I confess I knew who he was, and I knew he was on intelligence. I did not not know about his background. It's really impressive. And I think it is helpful to have members of Congress in the administration. I think one of the things that has hurt our foreign policy since 9/11 is a failure to have good relations between and bicameral relations, bipartisan relations, and between the executive and the legislative branch. So this seems like a very good pick. It is curious to me, though, that he's made this pick without knowing who, or at least announcing who, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State's going to be. To me, you want to get a team that can work together, and this is a little bit disappointing.
Well, that's not his management style. You see it already.
I know.
He likes to pit people against each other, see where that math leads. So I am in control. I will be deciding who goes, and you guys are going to be bopping heads against each other.
I guess I don't get the logic of clustering these three today, but maybe there is no logic.
Okay, late this afternoon, the New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman put out a statement saying that Donald Trump has agreed to drop $25 million, not drop, to pay fraud allegation lawsuits related to his Trump University real estate seminars. This was a big issue during the campaign, and Trump touted himself as someone who would rather fight litigation that he feels is unjust than sweep it under the rug. Okay, Mark, what does it say that he settled this case?
Well, it's a big surprise to me, and of course he said he would never settle, and he does not have a history of settling. It's, to me, a very good sign. Donald Trump is not someone who in the past looked at the kind of distractions that a normal presidential candidate would see and say, we got to get rid of this. Attacking McCain, attacking Megyn Kelly, attacking the Khan family. This, to me, is potentially at least a good sign where he gets it. He needs to be less encumbered as president from distraction. Wall Street Journal had an editorial today laying out a proposal to say how he could, at some cost to him and his family, deal with the conflict of interest with the Trump empire, financial empire. This, to me, is a sign today that maybe he gets that. He gets just clear the decks of stuff that's not presidential.
I agree for 2 reasons. First of all, he has said that whenever you settle a case, it means you lost. No, you made a business decision.
Right.
And this was a business decision that was right on 2 merits. Let's say as this thing went forward, it peeled out, and there was some really nasty stuff in there. Certainly not going to be good for his presidency. Even if he felt he was going to be exonerated, it was still the right thing to do. Even if it cost him $25 million, it's the president. We cannot have this going on. You have the ability to get this out of the way. Whether you were going to come out on the positive or the negative side of this, you have an obligation to get out of the way, and I think he did the right thing.
And by the way, I don't want to judge the merits because I wasn't a juror. I didn't see all the evidence. But based on the news reporting that was done on this, he owed those people some money.
Yeah.
That university was a scam in many ways. And while it may not have been as worthless as the critics said it was, I think he owed those people some money.
He sold some snake oil. Let's hope he didn't sell 60 million other Americans some snake oil.
All right, coming up, we're going to preview Donald Trump's weekend getaway plans and what it means for your weekend traffic and weather together right after this.
are some things that you just can't imagine happening in your life. This is one of them. Being in Donald Trump's magnificent hotel and having his endorsement is a delight. I'm so honored and pleased to have his endorsement, and of course I'm looking for the endorsement of the people of Nevada.
That was Mitt Romney in 2012 accepting the Las Vegas endorsement of one Donald J. Trump. 24 hours ago, we talked on this program about Donald Trump's planned tete-a-tete with Mitt Romney this weekend. The meeting is on. Several sources say that this is not just for show and that it's going to be a serious discussion about a possible cabinet position, Secretary of State's most often mentioned, for the former Republican presidential nominee. So far, the reaction to the prospect of Romney as Secretary of State has been met with very favorable views, including from Capitol Hill, though one source told me today that this meeting is in fact just for show. I'm not sure at this point where it really stands, but as I said, the reaction to the prospect has been positive. So, Donnie, what's your gut on whether this is real, whether Romney might end up with the job?
Somebody very, very, very high up in the inner circle yesterday told me it was very, very real.
Yeah.
They were very excited about it. They were one of the people very behind it. Look, we talked about this yesterday. This would be such a tremendous gesture. It would put so many people at ease, particularly the Godzilla, as you guys call it, factor keeps going up as far as what I'll call very truculent, very combative, very pugilistic, very kind of scary in certain ways figures. And to have a guy like Romney, whose biggest deficit that probably cost him the presidency was his calm and is the opposite of demeanor, I think would give a lot of people a reason for pause, for comfort. And if it is just for show and it is a head fake, well, then that's frightening in of itself. We're not going to know, though.
Well, the fact is, if he ends up not picking Romney and he picks someone who people don't react well to, who's not a stabilizing, comforting influence, I think it will be a problem. Yeah. You know, not necessarily not when they can't overcome, but it won't be ideal. I just can't tell you how well people have reacted that I've talked to today. Democrats, Republicans, foreign policy types. And the reality is, Romney is not like some softy on foreign policy. Romney was very aggressive on foreign policy, and his views in some cases deviate from Trump's, but not in a lot of fundamental ones. So,
well, the fundamental one is he was the first one to say that correctly Russia is our number one geopolitical enemy. The reason it feels so good to people is we are dealing with such an unknown now. Right. And he's a known. Right. There's a comfort, you know, everywhere we go, what is that? Wow, that smells kind of funky. Yeah. And to put somebody in there that we go, okay, he's a grown-up, he's smart, he's been around, it's comfortable.
It's going to be interesting to see what kind of reporting comes out of the meeting. If Trump does want to pick him, I can't imagine he's going to let it sit around for a while. I think my gut is if he wants him, he's going to pick him pretty soon. My only after the meeting.
Question is where I think he might not pick him. Yeah. If he was going to pick him, I think he would have just hit it as a surprise. Yeah. I mean, that would be more his style.
Still can. Trump's the master of the fake. Up next, we'll show you how Donald Trump's meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister was covered in Japan right after this.
has been a madhouse over at Trump Tower. Reporters seem to be spending every waking hour watching the parade of job seekers go up and down those gilded elevators. Today we sent superstar producers Matt Negrin and Griffin Hammond over to Fifth Avenue skyscraper TT to get a sense of what it's like at a Trump stakeout. And here is how the media is coping.
I'm here at Trump Tower to learn all the new rules on how the press can cover Donald Trump now that he's the president-elect. Rule number 1, live shots must be across the street. Hey, I'm press. Can I come through here?
No, you could go to 57th Street, though.
Okay, can't go this way.
We came through the Nike store. As we were walking down Fifth Avenue, we saw all of the press vans. It kind of hit us like, oh yeah, this is why they're here.
It is a weird setup. I mean, it's a public space. You know, you have this mix of tourists and foreign dignitaries, a lot of reporters, a lot of cops, a lot of Secret Service, a lot of big guns. It's Trump America, right?
We did have to go through some security.
And so a bunch of us press are camped outside on the ground floor of Trump Tower, waiting to see who's who and if anyone important is coming.
Could be a potential cabinet member, could be a celebrity.
Could be a celebrity, could be a tourist from Oklahoma.
Are there any rules, like you have to stay behind the rope?
It's not a lot of space, no, and there's a lot of us here. So one reporter was trying to sit down on the floor, and apparently they're not allowed to. It's inadequate seating, but I don't think they were planning for this. They're
using the Starbucks Wi-Fi?
Yeah, blazing fast Wi-Fi because of the Starbucks.
Can't be doing it in there. You got to be in the rope. Oh, you're going to do it.
Okay.
If you're going to interview
we can
people,
get in the rope. Yeah, sure.
You're going to interview people, you got to go outside.
Oh, no problem. We'll step inside.
Now, New Yorkers think we're the center of the universe, and in some ways, we are. Look, this is the most important city in the most important country, and the press is grappling with the logistics there. But this entire city now has been affected by the huge security presence there. It's untenable.
Yeah, it is. I live, less than a mile, 20 blocks away. Here's the reality. I'm talking after the inauguration. I've heard rumors that Trump is thinking about spending 3 out of 4 weekends a year here. That's not okay, because the millions and millions it would cost the city. Plus, you really can't protect that tower there. Skyscrapers looking down. It was not built for this. He's got Mar-a-Lago. He has an obligation to New York City and his voters. Once again, you come in here once in a while, but this cannot be his home away from home.
He's got to move his base of operations to New Jersey, to Florida, somewhere, not a skyscraper in the heart of Midtown Manhattan.
Impossible.
It is not just disruptive, and as you said, a security problem, but it's an irrational thing. There's nothing sensible about it except he wants to be home.
Well,
Donald Trump.
Okay.
All right. President-elect has fielded congratulatory calls from all over the planet since his election victory. Yesterday, though, he held his first face-to-face meeting with a foreign leader. That was with the very lucky or skillful Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. We could show you how the U.S. TV networks covered that sit-down, but we were more interested in how the American president-elect is being perceived abroad, so let's take a look at Trump Japan style.
In order to meet with Mr. President-elect Trump, Prime Minister Abe arrived in New York on the 17th. We have Hashimoto reporting live from in front of the Trump Tower, where they will be meeting. Prime Minister Abe has just appeared. He is heading toward the Trump Tower for the first face-to-face meeting with Mr. Trump. On-site cameras captured a horizontal long box wrapped with a ribbon. Could it be a present to Mr. Trump? What could be in the mysterious long box? Media coverage was not permitted, and only a select few were allowed in. Furthermore, the time and place of the meeting were officially announced by Mr. Trump only after the Prime Minister had departed Japan, adding to the list of unusual arrangements requested by Mr. Trump for this meeting. The scene where Prime Minister Abe shook President-elect Trump's hand took place at the very top floor of the Trump Tower. With chandeliers and grand stone pillars, interiors all adorned in gold, this is Trump's residence. I have been convinced that President-elect Mr. Trump is definitely a leader that can be trusted, that I can trust.
Very big domo arigato to Honore Arseki, our colleague, for helping us translate that news coverage. So I think, we talked about this earlier, I think Trump's personality gives him a chance to have instant rapport with foreign leaders.
Absolutely. It's interesting. Most presidents become politicians and presidents and then worldwide celebrities. This is a worldwide celebrity that became a president. And even world leaders get taken with celebrities. And Trump has this way. I'll never forget, after he won the Iowa primary, he called me to thank me for predicting it and says, you were the one to tell me to do this all along. I'm like, what? And by the end of the conversation, I'm going, how can I help you, buddy? I mean, he has that gift. He's a very charming guy, a very huge presence, and that celebrity status and that presence, I do think he's going to serve as well.
What I always say is if Barack Obama walks in a room, there are 2 people who like him and 98 who don't. He just talks to the 2 who like him. Bill Clinton and Donald Trump walk in a room with 99 people who like them and 1 who doesn't. They go right for the 1 who doesn't. They want to win him over. And world leaders, as you said, not just because he's famous, he's got a big personality. Why did Hillary Clinton say she went to Donald Trump's wedding? He's fun to be around. And I think it's going to help him get off to a very quick start establishing relationships with world leaders.
It is. Most guys, if you're Barack Obama and you're coming in for the first time, it's like you're the kid in the room. Prove it to me. He's a guy that he fills up a room, and we've been watching him around the world forever, so he's pre-sold, and I agree. I think his status in that way helps him only across the board.
Yeah, and a lot of these world leaders are unsettled now.
Yeah.
And I think when they get in the room with him and they see that he's a pretty calm presence, it's going to...
You can't not like him when you meet him personally.
Yep. All right, ahead of Mitt Romney's meeting with Donald Trump this weekend, we're going to check in with some reporters who covered his 2012 presidential race right after this.
Welcome back. We are joined now by national political reporter for the Washington Post, Phil Rucker, who's come to us from our nation's capital. Up in Boston, we have Globe op-ed columnist Scott Lehigh. Let me start with you, Phil. Okay, just from your reporting, Romney, scale of 1 to 10, 10 it's happening, 1 it's a pipe dream. Where are we on Romney?
I don't know, maybe a 4 or 5. It doesn't seem pretty firm yet, but there certainly is a possibility that something could happen. My understanding of this meeting tomorrow is that it's a more general conversation. Trump reached out, wanted to hear from Romney, wanted his advice on the transition to power. Certainly they're going to discuss the position of Secretary of State, but this should not be seen as a job interview kind of meeting. It's a broader discussion, sort of a peace accord, if you will, and we'll see if Trump actually decides to even offer him the job, or if so, if Romney would even be willing to do it.
You covered Romney. I'm sure you did not cover our new national security advisor. How do you imagine a temperament like Romney, ostensibly, I'm going to say reporting into, but the NSA is kind of the quarterback of the whole team. How do you see those 2 personas working together?
Not particularly well. I think they have very different approaches to sort of how to be a diplomat. They have different attitudes. They have clearly different patterns of behavior and views on issues like Muslims, for example. You know, I think if Romney were to be the Secretary of State, he would try to be cerebral and diplomatic around the world, but that would be a real clash with the National Security Advisor, and I don't know how they would work that out exactly. And one point in particular is Russia policy. I mean, Romney in 2012 cited Russia as our number one geopolitical foe. He was mocked for it at the time. Of course, now it seems prescient. But clearly, there's a disagreement on Putin and Russia between Flynn and Romney.
Scott, Lehigh, you know Mitt Romney's mind well. Besides the fact that people have said he's a patriot, if the president asked, he'd feel he should do it. What about his background, his interests, would make him want to give up the grandkids and go travel the globe to be Secretary of State?
Very hard for me to believe he would do it. It seems to me what they're doing here is sort of offering an olive branch to the establishment wing of the party by bringing people in for meetings. But I mean, it's hard to see how temperamentally, how ideologically, geopolitically, what Phil said about Mitt and what he thinks about Russia and what Flynn and President-elect Trump think about Russia. Also, Trump thinks that global warming is a hoax. Mitt, in his latest iteration, he's flipped and flopped a few times on it, but the last speech he gave on it, he said it was a very serious problem, something we had to address. The Western world hadn't done enough about it. So I just can't see it happening.
Scott, I hear your point of view, but I ask this question. You're telling me that if Trump offers it to him, he'll turn it down?
Yeah, I mean, I can't see, honestly, Trump saying to him, given Mitt's view of Russia and Mitt's view of global warming, I don't see why Trump would offer it to him unless they come to some agreement.
This cabinet's going to have people who support free trade in it. It's going to have people who, support NATO as it stands. I mean, I think if there's no way to staff a cabinet to have with Republicans and people who agree with Trump on everything. You're saying these are too fundamental?
I think that the view on Russia is so diametrically opposed that unless you work out some agreement, you can't have a foreign policy team that has really completely opposite views on what our nation's relationship or posture toward Russia should be. Trump seems to see Russia as a strategic partner, as does Flynn. Romney sees Russia as the biggest threat to the United States. I just don't see how you reconcile that. And I don't think it's one of those things, it's not one of those differences that you can kind of fuzz up and meet in the middle, I wouldn't think.
Phil, I want to go back to you on Flynn. He was fired after 2 years at the DIA, supposedly for a very contentious management style. Any kind of inside baseball on what he was like inside there and what was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back there?
Well, there was a real change in his behavior based on what his former colleagues say and what my colleagues here at the Post have been reporting, which is that he was a really decorated intelligence officer and regarded as highly sort of credible and efficient and good at his job, and his behavior really changed in the last few years, and especially since he left the government, he's gravitated more to these fringe elements, and he's, if you look at his Twitter feed, it's like Trump's Twitter feed, but on steroids. It's a lot of Breitbart articles and InfoWars and kind of conspiracy theories out there that is really not what you would expect from a retired three-star general and intelligence officer with the kind of background and gravitas that he had.
Phil, let me just stay with you for another question here about the Trump-Romney thing, which you can tell I'm quite interested in. Any sense of are there people in Trump's camp who are viewing this as a more positive and real prospect than others? In other words, is there somebody who's the mastermind of this?
Well, it's unclear to get real information about exactly where President-elect Trump's head is on this. Certainly people around him have been saying this is not really that real, but it could be real, and there's potential here, and clearly they're going to be meeting tomorrow and discussing something. And back to the point of whether Romney would want this, Mark, I think you were there about a year and a half ago at that Park City retreat that Mitt Romney had. He did a slideshow presentation all about foreign policy, all about how he would reorganize Foggy Bottom and what he would do around the world in all these hotspots. Clearly, this is something he's given a lot of thought to. I think his friends tell me he's sort of interested in getting back into government service, and if he did, Secretary of State is the one job he would prize.
Scott, last question, last minute. Just if Romney doesn't get offered it, do you think he'll stay supportive of the administration, or do you think if he's not inside, he's going to be a critic?
I think he will try to be a responsible, bring Trump into a little more, kind of more channel him into what Mitt thinks of as sort of responsible republicanism, rather than a little more toward the intemperate fringe elements where he now seems to sometimes lean. So I think Mitt would be one of those guys saying, look, let me try to mold this guy a little bit. Let me try to be supportive and nudge him toward the kind of policy he thinks prudent.
Guys, you've been great. We got to wrap it here. Phil Rucker, Scott Lehigh, thank you so much. We will bring in some really cool strategists next. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., like Phil does, you can now listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We will be right back.
We are joined now by a triptych of smart strategists. Sarah Isgur Flores, a Republican strategist, is in our nation's capital. Also in D.C., Adam Hodge, who is the communications director for the Democratic National Committee. And up at Fair Harvard, the very Ivy League, Dave Kochel, former senior strategist to Jeb Bush's presidential campaign and Iowa strategist for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. I continue with my obsession, whether Mitt Romney will be Secretary of State. Dave, I'll start with you. You know him well. Does the prospect of a Romney Secretary of State for Donald Trump make sense to you?
Well, it makes a lot of sense. I think it would send an amazing message to the world, a comforting message to the world, which has, I think, been shook up a little bit by this election and in the past year. So I think it would make a lot of sense. He's got a deep and abiding sense of history. He believes very strongly in the goodness of America and the goodness America represents to the world when it is strong. And I mean, he would be a great Secretary of State. I have no idea if it'll happen. I'm certain that his, his love of country would motivate him to listen to the conversation, to provide feedback, and to see whether or not it'd be a good fit. I think it'd be a genius stroke for Mr. Trump to bring in someone like Governor Romney, because I do think it would send a very strong and powerful message to the world.
Adam Hodge, my guess is when we get to discussing some of the denounced picks today, you're not going to be big fans. How would you feel about Mitt Romney as Secretary of State?
Well, first, I'd love to be a fly on the wall for that first meeting in the Oval Office between the two of them, or the fly on the wall in the conversation this weekend when Donald Trump and Mitt Romney go back and forth about all the terrible things that they said about each other just a few short months ago. So I think that's going to be a tough conversation.
But as an American and somebody concerned about America's future and security, would you welcome Mitt Romney as Secretary of State or not?
Well, I mean, I think that, Mr. Trump would be best served by having as many adults in the room as he can possibly get. But Mitt Romney certainly has his own challenges from his past that and his own record that I think would deeply concern a lot of the folks on our side. We'll have to see what happens with his nomination and his confirmation. A lot of people are going to ask some really tough questions about him. There's no question about that.
Sarah, if Donald Trump called you and said, should I pick Mitt Romney, what would you tell him?
I'd say yes. When you look at his picks so far, Jeff Sessions is probably going to be the most powerful attorney general we've had since RFK. And that's a great sign for conservatives who are interested in the judiciary, who care about the rule of law, because it means that we're going to have an attorney general who understands our issues and has the ear of the president. For someone like Mitt Romney to be named as Secretary of State is another great sign for conservatives who are looking to these next few weeks and the decisions that President-elect Trump makes as to whether conservatives will have a real voice in this administration. I also just think it sends a powerful message within the Republican Party. We criticized our nominee during the general election. Hillary Clinton had all these scandals, and Democrats really were lockstep and would never criticize her. To come together now with someone who had criticized him quite strongly, I think would just be a very magnanimous and powerful message that the Republican Party is going to lead this country and actually will help Americans fix some of these problems that have been plaguing us.
Adam, I want to shift gears to your party. There's probably only a 1 in 4 chance Ryan goes up against Pelosi. He gets it. I'm going to give you a theory that I would give it to him based on the Democrats just need some fresh faces at this point. Sometimes when the team is not going well, unfortunately, the coach, you got to move the coach out. Nancy Pelosi, I love her. I think she's done a great job. She's in her mid-70s, and one could argue just on freshness alone, they need some fresh faces there.
Well, look, she has been the most tenacious fighter for our party, and I think I would just listen to what the president said himself, that we wouldn't have gotten health care done without Nancy Pelosi, and I think we need a lot of really strong leaders to continue the fight in the next Congress. The House Democratic Caucus is going to make their choice in the next few weeks, and the members will make their own choice. But there can be no question about just what kind of a fighter she has been for our party over the last few years.
David,
this is actually a great example, though. Hillary Clinton had scandal after scandal. She was an extraordinarily weak nominee, even in the primary, and yet Democrats pushed everyone else out, including Nancy Pelosi, who helped with that, to make sure that Hillary Clinton had to be the nominee. And then, when scandal after scandal hit her in the general election, Nancy Pelosi was right there saying, no, we have to stand by Hillary Clinton. No one can possibly criticize her or help write that campaign. And that's why they're in the position that they're in, both at the White House and down ballot, where Republicans now have the Congress, 31 states, and Democrats are left with 5?
Adam, before I get to David, I want Adam to respond to that because, there is that argument. Look, guys, we just can't keep going back to the well.
No, but I think, look, we need as many champions and as fighters as we can have with us in the U.S. Congress. Look, I think that Nancy Pelosi, is no question, has been that leader throughout her career. And I think that's the kind of people that we're going to need standing up to Mr. Trump in the next administration.
David, let's switch back to Secretary of State. Let's assume Romney doesn't get it. Let's hope Giuliani doesn't get it. Mr. Trump is an avid viewer of this show. He's watching. Give him 3 good picks for Secretary of State.
Well, gosh, maybe General Petraeus. I don't know, Lindsey Graham, Nikki Haley. Let's be bold. I think we've got to have an adult. We've got to look. He's only got so many people in the inner circle. He looks like he's put some people in jobs now already. You've got Bannon, you've got Priebus, you've got Sessions already kind of lined up. He's going to have to expand outside of his inner circle, and I think we should get some fresh faces in around Mr. Trump. And the team of rivals concept has worked throughout history. Clearly, he is capable of bringing in a lot of diverse opinions and listening. He's showing himself at this point to be at least open to talking to a lot of people he hasn't talked to throughout the process. And it was a tough campaign, but it's time to turn the page. So I think if he can move in a new direction, find a few people who haven't been in the inner circle and bring in some ideas and some debate, you know, with maybe a little bit different worldview, I think we could have a very successful foreign policy going forward. Certainly more successful than we've had over the past 8 years, which has had a lot of failures.
Sarah, why should someone, Jeff Sessions, who couldn't be confirmed by the Senate for a federal judgeship, be made United States Attorney General?
First of all, that talking point has just gotten so silly. This was back when the Democrats were testing their Bork strategy. They then, right afterwards, block Bork. We turn it into a verb, to Bork. So this is what Democrats had been doing back then, was blocking people and calling them racist. Not much has changed, by the way. It wasn't a good electoral strategy then. It's not one now. Jeff Sessions is a very well-liked senator, and I think it's going to be extraordinarily hard for these senators who have worked with him for years to stand up and suddenly say, no, we're not confirming him.
Adam.
We didn't say anything this whole time, but now we're going to.
Sarah, I think you look at the record of Mr. Sessions back in the 80s. That was not a Borking. I mean, there are some really serious concerns and issues raised about his past, his temperament, and the things, quite frankly, that he said about African
prosecuted the leader of the KKK, and y'all are calling him racist. It's crazy.
But he also said that the KKK was he was okay with them until he found out that they smoked marijuana. I mean,
oh my God, he was sarcastic. He made a joke and said, "Oh yeah, I was fine with them until I found out they smoked pot." Sarcasm is lost.
Adam, is the DNC going to spend money and mobilize in grassroots basis to try to stop Sessions from being confirmed?
I think you're gonna see us stand up and fight as aggressively as we possibly can. Look, we can't, after the progress we've made under the last president, under Mr. Obama, we can't afford to turn back the clock to someone like Mr. Sessions, who would go back really 50 years. You look at his record, look at the things that he's fought against. You know, it's no surprise that Mr. Trump would pick him to be his attorney general, but is not someone that the American people can trust to defend the rule of law and defend them. I think you're going to hear from a lot of prominent voices who are going to express some extreme concern.
Okay, Adam Hodge, thank you.
He shouldn't be confirmed.
Okay, Adam Hodge, thank you. Sarah Flores, thank you. Great Dave Codgel, thank you. Coming up, Vanity Fair's Emily Jane Fox talks about Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. We'll be right back.
One of the most influential people in Donald Trump's campaign is married to his daughter, Ivanka. And that, of course, is Jared Kushner. We're joined now by a staff writer for Vanity Fair who's been digging into this unique Trump-Kushner relationship, Emily Jane Fox. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time from Vanity Fair. You've been following Jared and Ivanka for a while. You've written a couple pieces the last 2 days, one about Jared, today about the wall breaking down around Ivanka. I want to start with Jared. You know a lot of people that knows him. Just describe him as a guy. I mean, all we hear is a temperament. We don't know anything about this guy.
I think I still am struggling to understand who Jared really is. He's, by all accounts, very mild-mannered, very nice, well-bred. I think the assumption about him is he's not the sharpest tool in the box. I think his
That's not the assumption, frankly. That's what you're finding out.
That's what I'm finding out. I think, you know, there are reports that his father gave a large donation to get him into Harvard. His grades were not stellar before then. He took over his father's business when his father was behind bars. He married Ivanka, and now he's somehow wound up as one of the most
What do we know about, there's a 10-year, 11, 12-year period before the Observer where he was running a real estate business. What do we know about
It was only a couple years. He took over his dad's company at 25 and the Observer just a couple of years after that. So there really wasn't that much time between when he started running the Kushner company and took over the Observer. I think a lot of people who I've talked to say that the Observer was really a play to get him back in New York society and to kind of take over the press that had taken down his family.
My guess is, just knowing their circle a little bit, that many of their friends, I dare say most of their friends, did not vote for Donald Trump, right?
Well, look, Jared Kushner was a Democrat, and Trump was a Democrat.
So how are they dealing with their social circle? Probably pretty disappointed about the outcome.
I think their social circle is very small. They're a very insular couple. They're not your typical 34-year-old, 35-year-old couple. They're not out socializing with other 34 and 35-year-olds. They're out with their family. They spend a lot of time together as a couple. They have 3 young children. They spend a lot of time with Donald and their 2 brothers. And this is not really a social scene couple. This is very much a family, goal-oriented couple.
And with young kids.
Oh yeah, 3 young kids. They just had a baby in the spring.
I used to live in the same building. They always seemed delightful. You've written a little bit about that. There's a little bit of a kind of a Greek tragedy here, that a lot of this is about him kind of retribution, obviously beyond the Christie stuff, to kind of reclaim that name Kushner. Obviously, he was very close to his dad, very affected by his dad going to prison. Mm-hmm. I know you're not a shrink, but how much of this is behind everything?
Well, I'll tell you what other people have told me. One person I spoke to earlier this week said to me, the ultimate goal here is to get a pardon for his father. He's very close to this father. He used to visit him every single weekend when he was a young guy and his dad was away. The fact that he ousted Christie and all of the Christie allies within the first week of the transition, I think, tells you a little bit about how serious he is about reclaiming that.
Although people in the transition have taken pains to say it wasn't Jared's doing. Your reporting suggests otherwise?
My reporting does suggest otherwise,
well, of course they're going to do that.
So how did Christie get so close to the campaign to begin with?
I think Donald Trump is his own man at the end of the day. I think he also has a lot of people in his ear. Jared Kushner obviously has a loud voice in that ear, but there are so many other people who have their hands in this. And that's why you hear reports of a civil war within this transition campaign.
So does he want to go to Washington because he's ambitious, because he wants to help his father-in-law, because he thinks it's interesting?
That's the question of the day. Some people say he wants the proximity to power, which is a very intoxicating thing. Other people say he's just a really loyal family guy, and his father-in-law, who he gets along with.
You've not reached a conclusion yet on that?
I think it's so early. I think we'll see. I don't think anyone is clear on what the motivations are here yet.
The great Emily J. Fox, also known as EJF. Thank you. We'll be right back. Keep refreshing BloombergPolitics.com. That's where you'll find the latest updates on Donald Trump's meetings this weekend and on all of his White House hires. Okay, before we get to what's next, Mark was bragging to our last guest. He said, have you ever been on Entertainment Tonight? I don't know if anybody knows that Mark has been on
more than once.
More than once.
It's kind of my demo.
It is kind of your demo.
Kind of my demo.
Okay, so really quickly, you were kind of pushing back a little bit on the Christie thing. I got to believe that he was the guy that went Christie. I would do it.
I'm just saying they've denied it, and but it's still a mystery to me why Christie was so close to transition. Amazing fact. It appears we're headed towards Christie and Gingrich definitely not getting jobs in the administration, and maybe not Newt.
Okay, Bloomberg Technology is next. Until Monday, on behalf of my dear friend, on behalf of the missing John Heilman, sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's begin with a check of first word news. President-elect Donald Trump has agreed to settle fraud lawsuits over Trump University for $25 million. The suits allege the university failed to deliver the quality real estate investing education it had promised. The deal doesn't require Mr. Trump to acknowledge wrongdoing. President Obama is blocking the sale of new drilling rights in the Arctic and the Atlantic for 5 years. Oil and gas companies have been seeking new